I would like to begin our meeting by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we are currently situated, which is Western Australia. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, emerging, and recognize their contribution and their connection to the land, water, and culture. We acknowledge the contributions and resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Islander people in this region and across the nation. Hi, everyone. Hello again. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Parisa Izzat Panahi. I am an associate professor of architecture at the School of Design and Built Environment, Curtin University. I guess since ArchiTalk has evolved into a global platform now, I need to say that we are actually physically located in Western Australia, Perth, Western Australia, basically. It's been an honor to run ArchiTalk series and creating opportunities for our global architecture and built environment community to exchange ideas and inspire each other through these talks. Today, I am especially pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, our head of school, Professor SueAnne Ware. SueAnne, before I invite you to join me, I would like to actually read this short note I received. This is actually pretty impressive. Professor SueAnne Ware has over 25 years of design research practice through a set of critical lenses and discursive questions centering on themes of contesting the public realm, conflating intersectionality, provoking social engagement, and embracing radical hope. Her most recent work explores regimes of care and notion of feral, resulting in wild, unrestrained, or uncultivated states as they pertain to contemporary and historic practices in ecology, landscape architecture, and remediating toxic sites, and also gardening. I'm sure SueAnne will talk about those for us today. It's very exciting. Much of SueAnne's design research practice explores physical catalysts for social and political change, or more simply, design activism. She aims to incite action by using counter narratives to an unsustainable status quo. SueAnne is a co-founder of Outfit, and all-female collective of design practitioners and student volunteers who work in marginalized and disadvantaged communities. Outfit provides design and build services for women's domestic violence refugees, underfunded schools for students with special needs, and Indigenous community centers. She believes that landscape architects shares a responsibility for exploring political, social, and environmental agendas in public space. She is currently the head of School of Design and Built Environment at Curtin University, Perth, Australia. Thank you very much, SueAnne, for accepting our invitation.
Now here's our high-tech solution where I slide the chair over. I'm going to go through 5 projects relatively quickly today. So I'm not going to give you a lot of depth, but I wanted to cross a breadth. So I'd also like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people, and we are currently on their unceded land. I respectfully acknowledge the ancestors and elders, past, present, and future. And I think it's really important. I'm a built environment practitioner and educator. We are always on country, and it doesn't matter whether you're here in Australia or other place, there's always a First Nations person, a First Nations group whom you happen to be on their country. So thank them for letting us be visitors here. So I'm going to start with a pretty old project. As I said, I thought I'd talk about 5 projects today. So the first project is one of my PhD projects thousands of years ago. And yes, I am that ancient. I'm then going to move into a couple more public projects and then kind of end with more recent works, some projects that just finished last year. What I want to emphasize here is projects and their processes, because I think that over the years, my practice has tended to linger and engage quite deeply with what I call a process of becoming, growing, feral, and decaying. And I think it's because it is an overtly political and sometimes co-design practice. and I often work with disadvantaged and sometimes marginalized communities. I'm going to do a little bit of a backstory, which kind of explains why I might be interested in marginalized or, say, disadvantaged communities. Ooh. So on screen, you'll see a couple of people that I know really well. So my mum and dad, mum's a blondie, dad's a black guy. They were married in the mid 60s. Quite a revolution in America, mixed race marriage. Mum was Portuguese. She used to dye her hair blonde to look more American. And if you look on the other picture is a number of my siblings and my auntie and uncle. We're a mixed race family and there are 14 children and I'm number 7. Going forward, this is where I grew up. So this is a place called Jordan Downs in South Central Los Angeles. Those of you who have never visited the fine capital, no, I shouldn't say capital because that's Sacramento, but if you've never been to Los Angeles, I don't imagine you're hanging out in South Central, but if you are, Jordan Downs was recently razed. It was one of the worst commission flats in the country, but it gave birth to some pretty great music. And those of you who watch, well, NWA or straight out of Compton might know it well. It's on the corner of 98th and Vine. But I think when you grow up in a place like this, you might look at landscape architecture and perhaps a built environment, perhaps a bit different. The dude in the front is my daddy just before he left the planet. Okay, so the first project I want to talk about, and again, this is a content warning for those of you who might find this difficult. I am dealing with people who have overdosed from heroin. In other memorials, I'm working with people who were drowned as refugees and others, people impacted by the Victorian fires. So if this triggers or creates a difficult space of trauma for you, please feel free to shut this down and not listen, because it is quite challenging sometimes. So this is one of my early projects in Australia that wasn't working within an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. I had just become a level A academic at RMIT University, and this was the beginning of my PhD. And I won't tell you how old I was then, but I was well into my 40s when I got my PhD. We'll put it that way. So this project is really looking at heroin memorial overdose victims. And I call them victims because no matter what you think about IV drug use, you don't have to die if you have a safe injecting facility. One of the reasons people do overdose is because they use what's on the street. They use, heroin. It's not like it goes through any sort of process whereby the government regulates it. So sometimes it's stronger, sometimes it's not so strong, and people overdose. So this was at the height of the heroin wars in St. Kilda in Victoria. And there were some, almost 300 people were dropping every year. So it was unnecessary. The cross in the King's Cross in Sydney had just opened up a safe injecting facility, and it proved to be life-saving for a number of people. So those of you who don't know St. Kilda, this memorial took place on 3 streets: Fitzroy Street, Grey Street. So Fitzroy Street is kind of the Cafe Latte Street. Grey Street is where a lot of the social services are for IV drug users and other different kinds of social agencies. And down here at the bottom, which is Beaconsfield Parade, which is kind of the beach strip, if you like. So many of you may not know this fact, but Australia produces some of the largest amount of opiate puppies for legal use in the world. This is in Tasmania. These are puppies. If you don't know, heroin comes from puppies. Sorry, I should have said that. But puppies themselves are grown all over Australia, and then Big Pharma basically buy them and put them in legal drugs. So we actually are a large producer of opiates ourselves. And you might recognize this particular symbol. It's from Flanders Fields, World War I, Red Puppy, RSL. And this project deliberately conflates this particular memorial symbol. It brings it into a space where perhaps the RSL, and I have letters to prove this, wouldn't be so happy about it. So why did I do this? One, my younger sister, age 27, OD'd, needlessly, I have to say. And unfortunately, as someone who grew up in a fairly economically challenged situation, drugs were pretty rarely available. At this time in Melbourne, heroin was about 75 cents for a couple hits of smack. Oh, sorry, $75 for a couple hits of smack, and it was actually more expensive to buy a joint. So it was readily available, and it was cheap. Why did I do this project? Partially because we wanted to leverage the state government and the local council at that point to put in a safe injecting facility. People don't have to die. They don't have to get HEP. They actually can survive. But partially to stop the kind of guilt and sadness and or shame that comes with someone ODing. And I interviewed about 200 family members, friends, other IV drug users, social workers, you name it. In this project, I interviewed a number of people, and the heroin users come from all walks of life. Family members felt shame. They felt they couldn't mourn their relatives appropriately. Other IV drug users were never invited to funerals. So who are these people and why are they dying? And can we humanize them? So can we take them out of the statistics mode into who are they and why should their lives matter? As you can see, I appropriated a particular symbol in planter beds. Next to the planter beds, there were over 75 different stories from the loved ones, sometimes from family members, sometimes from other IV drug users, stenciled on the footpath in athletic field marking paint, so it's not permanent. It was part of Melbourne Festival. But next to the planters with the poppies were these letters telling you who they are, telling you about their lives, telling you how important they were. On top of that, quite low, affixed to the planters were these resin plaques. And this is where this tradition of spirit objects, which is from African American culture, but there are many cultures who believe that your spirit lives on within the objects. And so family members, friends often gave us pictures of photos or important mementos, and they said, we want this to be part of this memorial. And so you can learn about who they are. This person was a dad. This was just someone who didn't have any memorial, but remembered his friend Rob, and said he always wore this hat. And so they really wanted to have this sense of this person and their life mattered, and these things really helped them call to mind who this person was. So it was an assemblage. Again, the text, the planters, and the plaques all sat next to each other. These are images along Beaconsfield Parade. It was a part of a temporary festival, the Melbourne Festival, and it was in place for 6 weeks. Some of the things when you do temporary and impermanent work that you're trying to do is you're trying to capture that ephemerality. You're trying to see if people are going to engage with it or not. And unlike conventional memorials where you put them up high, an anti-memorial, you're trying to put them so people access them, they engage with them. They're not a giant bronze statue. They're not something that is there forever. They're like memory. They're changing and they're fleeting through time. So that was some of the intent behind the project. And of course, people did react. We were expecting a fair bit of vandalism. This is the public realm. We had all sorts of very interesting conversations with people from the RSL. If you ever want to have a chat to me, I'm happy to open up about that. But we found, by and large, people were incredibly respectful, so much so that they didn't walk over the text. And the text did fade. Athletic field marking paint does fade over time. It's basically the chemical composition is such that it disappears. It faded very interestingly, so certain words stood out, and then it disappeared altogether. People left flowers, they left notes. We thought people were going to steal the poppies, because why not? We didn't lose any poppies. The plaques stayed in place, and we actually gave the plaques to the families and people who wanted them after the project was over. I'm going to move on to the next project. Each of these projects is probably a lecture in itself, so I'm speeding it up, but I'm happy to discuss them more thoroughly at another time. So look, this is several years later, after I'd finished my PhD, and I was contacted by 3 Tasmanians, Steve Bidoff, who's a child author, a parenting author, Rod Horsfield, who's a Uniting Church minister, and a woman called Beth Gibbons, who's an arts administrator. And the SIEV X, so suspect illegal entry vehicle number 10, had just happened, and 350 people out of 390 had drowned needlessly off the coast of Australia, trying to come illegally, and I'll get into that in a second. This is Ware. He was one of the survivors. He was one of the 40. Now, I think you have to put refugees in context in this. Again, this is at a time when we had a lot of hype, the Howard government, there was a whole bunch of things about people being thrown overboard and all sorts of illegal trafficking of migrants and refugees with legitimate refugee status. So the people on this boat in particular were mainly women and children. The men were already in Australia in detention centers. The men were mourning the losses of their wives and children. It was a very sad, difficult period, of which the government, of course, was not happy to be open about it. So in walk the Tasmanians and the kind of newbie PhD practitioner / academic. And they say, so what can we do? So the first thing we did is we had a national competition, which was open to school-aged children, which we had to be very careful not to traumatize children, talking to them about, well, how should we remember people who were risking their lives trying to come to our country? A year 10 boy won it, and Bradley Evans, and Brad had a very simple idea. You'd get a bunch of poles, tall ones for the adults, short ones for the kids. You send them out to other schools across the country, New Zealand. You send them to refugee action groups. You give them to the dads. You give them to survivors, and you paint the poles. And basically one pole per person who died. Now, some of the people who died are anonymous. We never knew their identities. Some of the people we knew because their relatives were already here. So the Tasmanians being incredibly resourceful, found sustainably sourced timber. We sent them all over the world, and basically people decorated these poles as a part of this memory making and respect for people who had died trying to come to Australia. We then had to work with the Canberra government, both the ACT and the ACT, the territory government, and the National Capital Authority. At the time, the ACT was being led by John Stanhope, who was an incredibly left-wing humanist person, and the government on the right, the federal government, was being led by John Howard, and as you know, he potentially had some very different views about refugees. So we wanted to make this a national memorial, so we petitioned the government, and we got a one-day permit to put this project in the ground, and then it had to disappear. So talk about temporary and ephemeral memorials. We put it, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but we put it here, which is Weston Park, which is a park Weston Park is here, sorry. This is Parliament House, you should all know that. But this park in particular is a really important park for kids when they have their year 8 civics visit. They have a look at, they stop there for their picnic. It's also where the Governor General hangs out. Her house is nearby. So this is what it looks like. Now imagine, if you can, an invisible line. Within 2.5 meters of the lake, the National Capital Authority, so the federal government, controls the water, and 2.5 meters up. And the ACT, that's the territory government, controls the rest of the park. It's the only reason we got a one-day permit, because we had a park that wasn't entirely owned by the National Capital Authority. Interestingly, the poles came from various means. Some people brought them themselves. Other people used an incredibly diligent and eco-friendly, again, Tasmanians are always into this, delivery service, but the 360 poles arrived on the day. We laid them out, and you'll see, landscape architects are often working with clients to site things in sight, trying to figure out its relationship to Parliament House, its relationship to the water, its relationship to everything. And then in a 20-minute ceremony, over 2,000 people came, and they raised the poles. So Tasmanians, I've found out, are incredibly resilient and stubborn people, and they weren't going to stop at this sort of one-day event, which was incredible, very soulful. and a very moving situation. They wanted it in the ground. So what did they do? Or what did we do, I guess, as we waited till this guy went into caretaker mode, right? So those of you who are too young, there was this big election around 2006 and 2007. And what happens when a federal government goes into election mode is you get what's called caretaker mode. And so we were able to get a 6-week permit to put the project in the ground during caretaker mode from both sides of government. And then lo and behold, this guy lost, Kevin 07, those of you who remember it. And we had a different regime of care or a different political thought around refugees coming into this country. Always helpful if political timing works in your favor. So the SIEV X Memorial, which is still today, never meant to be permanent forever and ever, but in the end, it's now heritage listed, is in the ground. Now you'll notice the wavy line and the football form. Football form is the 14.5-meter size of the boat that 400 people were jammed onto, and mainly downstairs in the hull. And the wave is sort of playing a little bit of a game. It's partially about the ocean waves that carry people away. It's partially about the ACT side and also the NCA side, and sort of having a go at this sort of artificial division of land. And when you're in it, it sort of winds and weaves, and it feels like you're in a space where you can't ignore the stature of the short ones or the tall ones, and you want to engage with it. It's very much a community co-design project. My only job in this was getting it in the ground and making sure it was there, and collaborating across a range of very interesting political bodies. My only job, hey? Okay, so that's the second project. Obviously, you can see my political leanings are pretty far left. If I haven't scared you away yet, it'll probably get even further. But as you can imagine, this is still, we still don't conform to the UN Convention for Refugee Rights in Australia. So still working on this one. In 2009, the Black Saturday bushfires happened. And in some places like King Lake and Strathallan, the bushfires brought communities together. But unfortunately, in a place called St. Andrews, it actually drove the community even further apart. So I was asked by St. Andrews to come and work with a fairly unproductive, incredibly friction group of about 50 people on this memorial project. So Melbourne's on point A, King Lake is on point B, Strathallan is point D, our side is point C, St. Andrews. Now, the reason there was so much exasperation in these particular communities was that the tree changers had come in, and in St. Andrews, they had made it virtually unaffordable for people who had lived in the community for a very long time. The tax base rose, and the cost of property went up so high that people were being pushed out. So there was already a fair bit of angst among the tree changes and the existing residents. Then the fires came, and what happened was most of the people living in town didn't have a lot of property damage, didn't see a lot of damage, but the tree changers who had bought up the properties on the outskirts of town lost everything. And so there were a number, when we first got there were a number of very difficult public meetings where people in town were saying, well, what are you upset about? You could afford insurance, you'll get everything back. Now you can imagine someone who's just lived through a fairly traumatizing fire hearing that and feeling like they needed a bit more empathy. So this project took a long time to get everyone in a place where trauma and healing and acknowledging that everyone lost from the fires and that we had to do things differently. It wasn't a kumbaya moment, unlike King Lake, which was, fairly cohesive. There were a whole bunch of economic and social stratification issues here. So it was a much more complex project to do. I'm showing you the site of the, always good if you shut your door, of the site. So as you can see towards the bottom of the image is the actual town. Eventually, after much lobbying, King Lake National Park actually gave us a site. on Boldspur Road. Now, this site used to be a fire tower, serendipitously or coincidentally. So the fire tower burnt down, and they said, look, we think this is the right spot for the St. Andrews Memorial. And so we went through a series of conversations with the public, members of the families. There were 14 families who lost someone. Over 170 were dead in that particular fire. We went through probably a 3-year consultation, it was 24 months, and no, it's closer to 3 years of what are we going to do here? Why is this the right spot? Should we move it? And again, it was never easy, lots of friction, but in the end, we decided this was a good spot, at the clients being we. This is what Boldspur Road looked like after the fires. And as most of you know, fires are incredibly regenerative. This is pretty early on, so it was a really simple memorial. It basically consisted of stones. The lower terrace, which you'll see in the left-hand side or the right-hand side of the image, was for individuals. So we worked with family members and the survivors to locate stones with plaques and everyone's names. They could have the stone. They picked out the stones. They picked out where it went on the lower track. They decided whether the stone was standing up, whether it was flat, whether it was under the ground. And that was part of that, I'll say, grieving process, but also letting families bury something or be able to visit part of their dead when there were no remains found during the firestorm or after the firestorm. So this is that walk, and as you can see, the Strathallan Ranges and the valley spread out before you. Of course, if you went there today, you probably wouldn't be able to see much because the regrowth has been amazing. And as you went along the walk, you got to see various groups, and you got to see the inlaid name. There were lots of temporary and ephemeral memorials to and people left offerings to various people, notes, flowers, etc., which is kind of a common practice. This one is a particularly difficult one for us. It was a mum and a dad and a child. The daughter had been away at a friend's house and lost her entire family in one go. She was so brave. She came and talked to us and said, look, I want my brother to be between my mum and dad, and I want it this spot, not that spot. I want it where the sun goes down, not where the sun comes up. And so we she when she picked out the stones, she was very exact, and she's quite an amazing, resilient young person. As you move up to the top terrace, which is the top loop of that image, you see a circle of stones. We worked with a local Kurnai woman who was really intent on this to stop being the thing that separated the community, to try to bring them together. So the top terrace was much more about the collective grief and the collective memory of everyone who had been impacted by, and she was really clear. She wanted it to be a yarning circle, and she wanted it to be a place for people to come together and talk to each other, and perhaps shout at one point, she said. You'll notice on the ground there's a poem that she wrote that's Elizabeth King. And there's also, you'll see these tiny little dots, and those were called rain catchers, and they were for the 170 people that died, and they catch a little bit of water, signifying the tears. And this is her artwork. And it is quite a spectacular place to come and kind of contemplate bushfire and bushfire tragedies. We certainly did try to get cold burns and cultural burns as a management regime so that this wouldn't happen again, and the Park Service has taken us up on part of that, but not all of it. So it's always interesting what happens when you leave a project. 2 projects left, and then we can have some questions, I hope. So this is a more recent project, and this involves students at the University of Newcastle with students across 6 different local schools in Maitland. Those of you who've never been to Maitland in New South Wales, it's a pretty interesting place. It's where the jail is, it's where juvenile justice is, it's where the largest Aboriginal hospital in New South Wales is. It's a pretty interesting place. And it also has this amazing gallery called MRAG, so Maitland Regional Art Gallery. So this was really about our students at Newcastle were equity-based students. We had 3% of our students were Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders. And we often found that we didn't do enough work outside of the, the campus or outside of academia. So we started up a series of community-based projects, and this was one of them, and it's still ongoing today. Certainly that was we decided it was an important part of our students' education, as did our students. But what happened was, you got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, many of them who are off country, many of them who are just learning about their own Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander identities. Many of them had just found out they were Aboriginal, and they're learning about that. At the same time, they're working with architecture students, trying to think about a place that could be shared, a place that could be about knowledge, a place where it was okay to talk about some of the harder things that they were going through and that their family had gone through. And it was a really interesting co-design process. Happened, of course, in the middle of COVID. So that was also an interesting part of it. They made lots of stuff and they did lots of exhibitions, and there was lots of artifacts created that got recycled and upcycled later. But it just became about, well, what do you do in this space? And then how do you actually take it to the next level? So each architecture team had a school that they were in charge of, and there were some reoccurring themes such as Honeysuckle, Bushfire Garden, bush medicine. Sometimes things were serpentine, sometimes they were circular. There were whole things around flags, Sorry Day, you name it. And we had to take all those things after having 6 different designs and make them into one. And ultimately, the Aboriginal reference group for the museum, for the gallery, came along and said, we like everything, but we want you to do the biggest thing, which is at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the public-facing space. We want there to be the biggest yawning circle that we can have, where we can do much more open-minded things and take the art out of the building. And so that's currently under construction, as is the Sorry Day flower garden that's at the front steps of the gallery. So there were lots of compromises, but the intent of the garden and the students' designs and the students' ideas were adhered to. I do have a film of that if you'd like to see it. Anytime, ask me. I'll post it to you. It actually goes through the process in much more detail. And you get to meet some of the kids. Last project I'm going to talk about today with my 15 minutes even. It's probably this is although I'm a landscape architect who's interested in entropy and ephemerality, this is probably the longest standing project I've had in Australia. It's an interesting one. When you live in a place like Newcastle, you find out all the fun stuff. So in the Hunter Valley, there were 1,000 toxic sites. And those of you who've never been to Newcastle, it used to be a steel town. Now it's home to the largest coal port in the world. It used to just be the Southern Hemisphere, but now it's the world. It is very much still an industrial city. Within the CBD, so the very tiny LGA of about 300,000 people, but within the CBD, there are 50 toxic sites that the EPA were not happy for anyone to go on. So it's a pretty difficult city in terms of toxic sites and former land uses, not unlike many urban areas these days, but Newcastle has a high concentration. This is what was on the site before we were. So this is the old steelworks, BHP, and it was blown up. And again, I have a film of this, and you can see it getting blown up when they decided to raise it, and BHP gave the land back to the city. Not necessarily land that you'd want back, by the way. So what did we do there? So why have I shifted from temporary and ephemeral memorials and working with various marginalized communities to land that's severely degraded? Well, those of you who know about land value and prices of housing and prices of apartments, you've probably guessed it. If you live in a dodgy area that has lots of toxins, that used to be a steel factory, that used to be a tannery, that used to be a place where they made creosote to put on rail. Creosote is the stuff you put on railroad ties to make sure it doesn't degrade. If you live next to those in a place, if you live next to those things, you're probably not living on the highest land value. So the marginalized communities in this case are sitting next to one of the largest toxic waste sites in New South Wales, if not Australia. The housing prices are quite affordable in one way, but you could imagine that you can't. There are signs everywhere. The council won't let you dig in the ground. It's pretty dodgy. So the reason we got involved in this, aside from the fact that usual clients, you're from a very bourgeois profession called landscape architecture, you want to help people who probably don't know what a landscape architect is, and you want to make a difference in their daily lives. So what do you do? Well, you work with an incredible team of scientists from UTS, and you work out things like phytoremediation. So this has been around for centuries. Most of you who know something about water-sensitive urban design would know that that is a form of phytoremediation. It's just where plants can either absorb toxins and hold them in their roots, stems, leaves, trunks, flowers, or some plants and some toxins, depending on how much, usually with heavy metals, but how much stuff is in the ground or in the soil, they can actually metabolize the toxins. So this garden was all about phytoremediation. It's a 5-acre site. Like I said, the former steelworks, and it is the former, like the CEO of BHP who used to come and stay in this cottage when he was overlooking his workers. It's his former home. It's a really interesting site because it's right next to the largest industrial roadway in the city. So we had four types of gardens. Sorry. The first was a kitchen garden. Yes, we wanted to grow vegetables, partially because we knew people were growing vegetables in the neighborhoods next door, and it's the same soil. Okay, so we wanted to know what the vegetables were absorbing, what they weren't absorbing, whether it was safe to eat the vegetables, and we needed to do it in a way where we could use AR and VR part of the project so people could find out, hey, maybe I shouldn't grow carrots. Carrots are kind of interesting. They're called hyperaccumulators. They actually can hyperaccumulate arsenic. So we had a very, very large amount of arsenic in our soils, and the carrots per square meter were absorbing up to 5 cubic meters of it, which is huge. We also wanted to know where the vegetables in this case, or the fruit in other cases, were storing the toxins or heavy metals. And it becomes really important because if you're going to eat this thing and it's being stored in the thing you're eating, so i.e. don't eat carrots from an arsenic-laden site because it is stored in the roots, i.e. the carrot. But tomatoes, weirdly enough, didn't store any toxins and didn't remediate at all. They just survived. Other things like lettuces and some of the brachiots, some of the beetroots and other things did other things, but it became really important so you knew what was safe to grow if you knew you had some problems with heavy metals. And how do you know you can have heavy metals in your soil or you have toxic soil? Well, look at what was there before you and it's pretty obvious. Or just get your soil tested, which was free. So you see things like manganese, lead. Lead, remember before we had unleaded cars, lead-based petrol, but lead was also used as a solvent. Copper, chromium. Copper probably came from copper pipes and copper guttering of houses. And you'll see that certain fruits, vegetables, herbs absorb certain things better. So if you're trying to get stuff out, you use them. If you're trying to keep stuff in, you don't use them. If you want, and the amount of materials and heavy metals that they're absorbing is far more than you want in your body. So that's even more important. Next to the house, so there was the kitchen garden, but next to the house, there's also a cottage garden. And we used a series of small trees, shrubs, both native and exotic. You'll notice the giant kangaroo paw there, which sometimes there was a lot of phosphates near the house. They were using it to wash their boots. And so it's extremely toxic and you really don't want it to get in the water source. But sometimes toxins help you, like create monster kangaroo paws. The kangaroo paws, by the way, did absorb the toxins, but it didn't go into the flowers. And this becomes really important for us because we were really interested in whether bees and other pollinators, so birds and things, were going to get the toxins from flowers. And yes, of course, there are some plants which hold the toxins in their flowers. You also get things like litmus plants. So you'll see the hydrangea above. Any of you have a hydrangea at home will know if you put a tea bag next to it, it'll turn a different color that year. Hydrangeas are a typical litmus plant, just like chemistry or when you took that in high school. Ours started off as it was supposed to be white. It was never white. You'll see that hyper pink. That was from a lot of the iron that was found in that part of the garden bed. And then you'll see that it eventually got to a funky kind of blood-stained white, but we never quite got there. So that kind of shows you a bit about plants and that they tell you. We planted a number of orchards. We removed some of the trees, and I don't have the results for you yet, but they're just being tested now. The orchards were really looking at street trees of the future. So obviously a tree is going to be in the ground a lot longer than, say, a vegetable garden or even in small shrubs. It's going to be in the ground up to 25, 40 years. We were looking at trees that were more climate adaptive. So we wanted trees that could take hotter weather, less water, but also heavy metals generally coming off the roads. And I think, these kind of things become really important for cities when they start to invest in new street trees, because street trees do grow old and die. And the kind of testing we were doing here was both what they were absorbing, where they were absorbing it, or if they were incredibly resilient. So some of the exotics that we planted here, and in this case it's crepe myrtles, they pretty much could withstand a bomb. It was incredible. We had pretty much everything in this part of the site except for radiation, and all the trees survived, but the crepe myrtles turned into these amazing trees. So we think crepe myrtles must be toxin resilient. Down at the bottom, we did the meadows, and the meadows were probably the most effective at clearing the toxins. They're also probably the most photogenic, as you can see. We planted 2 different meadows every year on the same site for 5 years, and we cleared the entire site to be safe within Australian standards. This was the worst part of the site in terms of pollutants. It was the lowest part of the site. Water carries toxins downhill, but also it was close to the former creosote factory. And we experimented with monocrops. So you can see one here with cornflowers. You can see one with mixed crops. You can see another entirely with sunflowers, pointing at, it's funny, the heliotropic processes of sunflowers, they follow the sun. And you can see it's pointing at the heavy industrial port across the fence line, which is also on incredibly toxic land. But it's kind of nice when your sunflowers are like, hey, look what we can do. We did try to attempt to get the other acreage of land that you see across the fence, but we didn't. We wrote a big grant and got knocked back, as you do. But what was really interesting, what we learned about from things like sunflowers, and again, you'll see it in the yellow bars, they were by far the best performers across the worst toxins. And it wasn't just any old sunflowers that happened to be the Vincent van Gogh ones with the really big head. We were really concerned about the toxins being in the head of the sunflowers, but it actually stayed in the rhizomes, so in the roots. So what does this mean? I guess, yes, I've been on Gardening Australia, not as many times as Josh, but at least once. What became important about this project, aside from the kind of scientific findings and ways to think about people who lived in the region, and near this site in particular, how they could be safe, is it became very much a public outreach center, and it became a place where people came to learn about how you can actually take out toxins from soil in a more natural way. Now, we're talking about, normally in Australia, we either cap a site with a clay or a concrete cap. Caps always get breached, they always leak. Or we scrape a site, so we take thousands of cubic meters of toxic soil away, and we make it someone else's problem. Those are not sustainable methods, by the way. So by planting a garden that's taking out toxins, you still have green waste, which is toxic. We composted it. So if you just remove the green waste, you go from thousands of cubic meters to about, I don't know, we kind of calculated if we took all the green waste away, it would have been hundreds of cubic meters. but we didn't. We composted it down into this really nasty toxic sludge, heavy amounts of lead, copper, manganese, etc. And we took that toxic sludge, and it had to be taken to an appropriate facility. But we're talking 7 liters of sludge per annum, as opposed to thousands of cubic meters of soil. So I think I know which one's better. If we would have had lithium contamination on our site, we would have been able to recycle the lithium out of the composted sludge, and we would be millionaires, and you wouldn't know me today. But we didn't have lithium. These sort of show you the kind of, again, I know you guys are so cool on graphs, right? You can see, though, that the Australian standards for various toxins such as copper, chromium, calcium, arsenic is much higher. So the red lines that you see above are the Australian standard, and then you'll see a line that's in international standard. So in this particular year, and we have these data now for the full 5-year period, we were trying to reach international standards, because while Australia seems to be, let's say, not as stringent as international standards with toxins in our soils, certainly you want to reach national standards. The garden had AR, it had VR, it has all sorts of ways of being interpreted, so you didn't need a docent. It was open to the public, which was kind of interesting. We had to make sure that people didn't eat the vegetables, so we did have that area fenced off and not accessible, particularly for kids. But it was probably, for a landscape architect who's not the best at gardening, it was probably one of the most interesting projects I've done to date. We would have had at least 2,000 visitors a year, which doesn't sound like a lot in the scheme of things, but for a small city like Newcastle, where you're trying to help people out, you're trying to get it so that they don't ingest toxins, so that they can do their own phytoremediation and do their own citizen science, which we ended up then starting a whole movement around citizen science. I won't go into that too much. But it became a really important site for how you can make landscapes and things that are more than human through another means. But also, like I said, the housing prices around the area kind of demonstrate that most people who live on toxic land are in marginal communities or in an economic situation that's not what you'd like. Back to why I called this talk what I did. I always think it's good to give a definition every now and again. This is from Frodlook. Think that you're constantly trying to challenge the status quo. I don't know a single designer or architect or landscape architect, interior architect that isn't challenging what's known. But in my work, I am overtly political, and I deal with some of the most overt political processes, which sometimes scares universities. And if I showed you some ethics processes, you might give up earlier. And there were definitely days when I thought about leaving the academy, because there are a lot easier places to practice this kind of way. I'm going to end with Radical Hope. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read Jonathan Lear's work, he's got a new one out. It's really looking at when we find it out as humans that our existence is really not going to be forever, and we're facing that with climate crises, we're facing that with wars, we're facing with a whole bunch of different challenges these days. So how do we have hope to go forward? How do we not get subsumed by some of the terrible things happening? How do we become agents of change? How do we start to take, our fantastic educations and bring forward another kind of courage, something that transcends what we currently do. Right on time. So if you haven't read Jonathan Lear, please do so. I think it's probably one of the most pivotal things I've read recently, and hopefully it helps you think about your own practice. So with that, I think I'm opening it up to questions. Ta-da! On time.
Fantastic, thank you. I think they'll hear me if I talk from here. I just open that to everyone. That was really fantastic. Thank you for sharing your insights. I guess the way you captured the complexity of the project, especially with those memorials, the way you captured the complexity of the grief and memory and care in the built environment was quite interesting. To me, what was also very prominent was the fact that yes, your projects acknowledge the loss, but also invited important conversations between people, and the community engagement was pretty highlighted. So thanks for sharing all of those with us. I think I'm going to open that to audience. If you want, you can type your questions, or just turn on your microphone and ask. Justin.
Of course.
Oh God, I always seem to be
Okay.
I really enjoyed that talk. Thank you, SueAnne. I was just really interested in both between the sites of memory that you were dealing with, and also which can in some senses after horrors are sites of human toxicity or sort of spiritual psychic toxicity, and the sites of actual chemical toxicity caused by sort of industrial processes. But what I was really going to ask about was when you said, how can we take people out of the statistics mode that they sit in certain circumstances? I've just been watching on the news some of the the freeways going north out of Tampa and Florida, and getting a small hint of that potential coming wave over the next 10 to 30 years. And as Australia hits a different set of climates coming in, but also potentially hits, again, as it doesn't align with the UNHCR, as it hits massive inward migration from places like Indonesia and such like, how would we think of radical hope in that sort of coming future?
Good question, Justin. I think, look, it's a for me, I mean, we're seeing it now in education with international caps. There is a kind of a fear mongering that comes around international student caps. Sorry, there's a way of making those who are not us or those who are other the villain. So one of the things that I think Radical Hope starts to help us do as a practice is to start to, I mean, yes, of course, we could all pretend like we're all the same in Kumbaya, but that's not the way it works. There's very diverse in the world, and I think what we have to come back to is that they're humans, or more than humans in some instances, and that if we don't start to learn empathy and we don't start to think differently, sooner or later the tables are going to be turned, and we're going to need someone's help. And I think, watching the fall of America, which I believe we're now at a point where the dynasty is dying, regardless of who wins the election. Although let's just all hope for Kamala. The fall of democracy is not necessarily that it's a bad system of governance. It's more the latent capitalism and the things that came along with it that create this kind of situations of haves and have-nots. And so what I would say is that Australia is incredibly, the lucky country in one sense, but I think that we will be so deeply impacted from climate change that we are going to need help from the outside world. So if we continue to isolate ourselves and stick our heads in the ground and say, yeah, it's someone else's problem, I think when we reach out our hand for help, we'll be lacking. So I think we probably need to learn that lesson. I don't think anyone's going to ever invite me to run for any party or any political office. I think that we just have to transcend, and I think as not just as a society, but how can we look at what's happening in the world today without shifting? I mean, and the best thing about students is they often tell you, this is what your generation did to us, and we're going to do better than you. And that's what we have to promote. That's the radical hope, that we can do better than that my generation did, for instance.
Thank you, SueAnne.
Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. We have two more questions from Atik. Thanks, SueAnne, for sharing such an interesting soil remediation project. My question is, how many harvest cycles did you try to meet the national standards, or was it a pilot to demonstrate that remediation is possible? Another question, do you see any similar applications for the Perth port redevelopment project? From Atik.
Okay, so with the phytoremediation project, thanks for the question, Atik. So we had that land for 10 years. It took us 3 years to get a permit to do anything. 5 acres is tiny, by the way, in the scheme of things, in a city that has 50 toxic sites well and truly over international and national standards. But with the most promising trials were the acre of various wildflower meadows, and because they remediate quite quickly, they grow in one season, so you can plant them 2 times a year and you can get 2 full crops that remove toxins. We found that the mixed meadows took out more toxins than the ones that were single species, including the sunflowers. We did single sunflower seasons. We did them for 5 years, so twice a year for 5 years, a whole bunch of different kinds of plants in all sorts of meadows, both native and exotic. It's probably the most practical application, I would say, is for brownfield sites. So if you look at like what WA is trying to do with the old Beaconsfield TAFE, you look at a number of those sites are toxic. They just aren't necessarily toxic with some of the stuff we had on ours. When I look at our port, because I live pretty close to Freo, and I think there's some very interesting things. The water table levels are a bit different, and obviously the soil typology is a bit different, but I think you'll find that it has similar toxins embedded in it, so I think some things could work. I think it's always, it's always about the value of the land, and I mean that in the capitalist sense. So if the land is of high value, i.e. next to the waterfront, you'll probably find that they won't take a long time to remediate it. They'll want to cap it or scrape it, and make it someone else's problem and sell the land off to developers because it's more economically viable to do so. However, if there's anyone listening out there who'd like to get me involved or others involved, I'm happy to talk through why a 7 to 10 year remediation process might be a better idea. And my understanding is they call WA wait a while for a reason. So if it's going to take 7 to 10 years to have it happen anyway, we might as well be remediating it while we speak.
Thank you, SueAnne.
Cheeky.
Thanks, Atik. We have a few more questions, so we'd better be a bit quick. Sally Matthews. Hi, Sally. So great talk. Am I able to access a set of outcomes from the Newcastle project? For example, which plants help with which toxins for future projects, please?
Absolutely. So if you go to that website, www.delpratgarden.org.au, you will find all those graphs and then some. There's also the final reports, which go into really detail. And will give you the species and everything else. Also, our scientists at UTS and the UTS Phytoremediation Lab, they publish the proper scientific papers about it. So if you look up the UTS Phytoremediation Lab, they'll give you even a wider group of plants than what we used on our site. But certainly it's all online in that website.
Fantastic. Another question from Darcy. Be interesting to look at Port Pirie. What kind of stratum depth is the phytoremediation able to work at?
Good question, Darcy. So it depends. Well, okay, obviously on that site we were working on a large hill. So where we planted the trees, we had a much deeper soil, although it was incredibly crap because it was clay. On other parts of the site, we didn't have much. We only had at the very bottom where the meadows were, part of that site had an old petrol tank underneath it. So we only had about 250, 300 mil with the soil. So we've worked at all different depths. And so you can use plants that are deeper rooted or more shallow rooted. The grasses and the meadow plants tend to clear shallow rooted and shallower soils faster. They also, just like water sensitive urban design plants, where you're looking at bioswales and things like that, where you're wanting them to take out heavy metals before you put the water back into the system. So it all depends on the specifics of the site. But yes, certainly you can do both.
Fantastic. Thank you. Atik has mentioned, let's discuss this with Development WA. Great redevelopment process. And thank you, Chantal. You have, I guess, provided the link already. She's found the link and shared with others. Okay, fantastic. pretty good timing. It's 1 p.m. already, and I know that SueAnne has other commitments. Very busy day today. Thank you so much again for accepting our invitation. This talk has been recorded, so you can access the recording via our ArchiTalk.org website or our YouTube channel, and well, this talk and the rest of them. All the best. Thank you very much for joining. Thanks, SueAnne. I'll stop the